Love Thy Neighbor, the Disability Awareness Forum here that we are having for 4 Sundays, and today is our second session. Last week we had a full house and a very spirited and wonderful conversation around, some myths and misconceptions about disability. We're going to continue the conversation today, and I have got a video that I want to show you guys, and then of course I'll make those connections as we think of barriers and all of the challenges that people with disabilities face, whether it's in society or in a church community, and in this particular context, the church community. So we've got a couple of people who are new. I always, because I believe in inclusivity, I always believe in introductions. We started last week with introductions, and I think the new people that we have here, if you could say a little bit about yourself, how long you've been in the church community, and then of course, if there's anything associated with disability, whether you have a disabled person in your life, whether it's a spouse or a child or someone and what you know about disability generally, I will appreciate that. Again, I'm Rodney Hume-Dawson, and I'm facilitating this. On my other side, I'm actually a professor of disability studies at Cal Poly Pomona, and so that's why I get to do this. Yes. All right. Who would like to start? I know Carol and Rachel, and of course Sharon have already gone, so Joel, will you do us the honor and telling us about yourself a little bit? Do we need a mic so that everybody can, since they're live streaming it? Yeah. Joel, do you want to get this mic to people when they're introducing themselves, just in case, since they're live streaming?
I'm Joan Watson, and that's my husband, Chris Watson, and we've been a member of the church since 1982. And so as you can guess, we're quite old now. I worked for a cardiologist administrator for 34 years. So, I dealt with a lot of patients who'd had open heart surgery, and so I got used to seeing a lot of people that perhaps were not as able to get around as some people. And my husband is, of course, we're both retired, of course, now. And, you think about that we are older, and what does the future hold for us? I'm not sure. We'll find out. Did you want to say anything?
I'm Kay Alexander, and I've been a member of St. Mark's since 1992, and I don't have much experience with any disabilities other than my first husband was pretty much in a wheelchair the last, very few weeks of his life and on oxygen. So, of course, we had to figure out how to deal with that. So, but as Joan said, as I'm getting older, we have to be thinking about ourselves also and what may come.
I'm Kathy Osterkamp, and I've been here for 4 years, I think. I keep thinking it's longer, but it just, I mean, in a good way, But I saw a lot of children with disabilities in school when I taught, and my partner had a stroke about 7 years ago, and so I kind of am a she's in a facility, but I'm a caregiver for her, and in a way, and I tend to worry about everything, and then I start worrying about me, and then the worry cycle just goes on and on. And what am I going to do if I can't help her? Things like that. So.
Thank you so much. If you introduce yourself last week, we're going to I just want to speak those. No, you're fine. This video that I'm going to show you, thank you, was done by, it's actually an interview by a lecturer at Manchester University, interviewing one of the gurus in disability studies, Dr. Rod Michalko, who is a professor of disability studies in one of the universities in Canada. Rod Michalko has been blind since he was 14, and he is a sociologist by training. And what he does in this video is very fascinating. He gives an interpretivist lens into disability. I won't say much about the video, but I'll tell you that what interpretivism is, it's a subjective lens based on your experiences, right? And it's in contrast to positivists who believe that everything has to be run by data, and has to be objective and all that kind of stuff, right? Positivists tend to be, strict scientists, researchers in the science field who are so driven by data. But we in disability stress this point about the subjective based on our own experiences, right? You come to know a lot more about the disabling experience when you actually talk to disabled people themselves. All right, so here is Dr. Rod Michalko.
Come along to Critical Disability Studies at Manchester Metropolitan University. Very lucky we're over in Canada, we're in Toronto, and it's my great pleasure to have with me today Rod Michalko. Rod, thank you very much for joining us. Can I kick off just with some kind of general things around disability? When you think about the word disability, what kind of things crop up for you?
Well, there's a number of things. Disability is one of those words. I mean, all words have meaning. And some of them, as a sociologist, actually from Britain, once said, some words have meaning, some have a feeling. And disability is one of those words, both a meaning and a feel. So there's all sorts of meanings, as you know, that disability has in our cultures, particularly in Western society, but in all societies. And in the global North, at least, the disability comes with the meaning of inadequacy, of lack, of incompetence, of dependence, and so on. And it also comes with a feel, and the feel is typically what no one wants to be.
Right.
And so, we move through the world as disabled people, or at least some of us do, in the midst of all of these meanings and feelings.
Right, I'm glad you said moving through the world, because it brings us beautifully, effortlessly into a discussion of one of your, for me it's a classic in disability studies, which is 2-in-1, Walking with Smokey. I've got that title right?
Walking with blindness, walking with Smokey, walking with blindness.
I'm glad we were both stumbling around this modern classic.
That's right.
But seriously, it's a classic piece of writing.
Thank you.
Can you, in a nutshell, could you capture what that book is about? What is that saying to disability?
It's saying to disability that when we move in the world, we never move alone. And in some sense, we're moving through all sorts of versions and concepts of disabilities, people who are invested in the meanings and feelings that they give to disability. And that's how disability comes to people, including disabled people, with the meanings and feelings I was talking about. So we're always in company of those things. Now, the Smokey, my guide dog, Smokey, happen to be a bit more concrete version of accompaniment in the world. Right. And of course, as a dog, in the book, I kind of talk about him as representing nature, whereas I represent people or society or culture or something like that. So the two are coming together in some interesting kinds of ways. Now, Smokey cares about blindness in certain ways, and so do I. And, I don't know exactly what he has in mind, nor does he know exactly what I have in mind. So that's why I speak about us moving to the world, through the world, alone and together, together. And it's a kind of an interesting thing because he moved me through the world, and I moved him in the world by giving him commands, left, right, etc. He decided how he was going to get to where I wanted to go, and he moved with blindness. And his concern with blindness was movement, and not just practical utilitarian movement, which all of us do, but a movement with some version of grace, or as we say in North America, some sort of class.
Nice.
So if my blindness had any class, had any oomph at all, it was because of Smokey's moving that way.
I mean, that's really, I like the word of class, but you've, and notice in other work you've referred to the coolness of blindness. Oh, the blindness is cool. Can you say a bit about that? Because that's, I think, particularly from a British disability studies perspective, the notion of coolness, obviously links to kind of more affirmative ideas. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, I think this idea of cool and being cool and blindness, and for me even, I mean, I know, cool doesn't come to mind when I think of blindness. I mean, in fact, it's just not cool. So then I need to think about Smokey. And he was cool. He made my blindness extremely cool. And just a simple little example about moving in the world. I walked through a bar once, and some people were playing pool. Right. And they sort of I said, excuse me, and they made some sort of a joke about they've got a really, really tough shot. And so I joked back saying, but I might be able to make that with my white cane. Right. And so, one thing led to another, and I actually switched my white cane for the pool cue with this guy. And he lined up the shot, and somebody else was at the other end making sounds where the ball was, and I did hit the ball and sink it. Right. And the place erupted. Now that was cool. That was cool. Now what was more cool was being able to move in a world where I often talk about blind people, and one of the more typical or stigmatized or common versions of blindness is the white cane and dark glasses, of course. And so I often think about what's interesting is that I think as blind people, we have a much cooler and clearer understanding of sight than do sighted people. Right. Given we need to sort of figure out what it means to see and what people can see, etc. And what's cool about that is when people look at us, when people look at blind people, and by extension, at disabled people. I mean, what I think they're really looking at is themselves. They're looking at the meaning they're giving to us, the feel they have for us. And so I talk about blind people's shades as mirrored lenses. So when they're looking at us, they're looking at themselves. Now that's cool.
Yeah, that is cool. Yeah. I mean, on that kind of that notion of that. So non-disabled people are looking at disability, and actually what they're doing is they're figuring out a lot about themselves. Can you say a little bit more about that? Because I think that's an interesting kind of intervention into the field, really.
Well, I think that's one of the things that disability studies has to offer the world, not just the academic world, but the world, and that is that we do look at disability. Those of us who are disabled, those of us who aren't, and particularly those people who are not disabled, look at us in particular kind of ways, and we're the type of people that are to be looked at. Right. So that, but whether or not non-disabled people figure out whether or not they're looking at themselves is another question. But what I think disability studies, at least one of the things disability studies can offer, is non-disabled people, or the normates, we offer, or Irving Zola has a much better phrase, world of the normal. So what we offer the normals in their world is the occasion to look at themselves. Right. Through and in our shades. Our
Right.
shades.
Well, that sounds a lot more kind of positive take in one sense on the ways in which the kind of non-disabled gaze is being conceptualised. I mean, it tends to be conceptualised in a very negative, very pathologising way. But what you seem to be saying is actually in the gazing, this allows a possibility for re-establishing or rethinking one's sense of who one is, and also with the notions of disability. Have I got that right?
I think so. And it is the occasion.
Right.
It isn't a guarantee, of course. And it's not a guarantee that me as a disabled person will take that occasion either. But those occasions are there, and those occasions are also there to speak of disability and disabled people as involved very heavily in survival. As you know, because of very, very expensive conditions in the south, a lot worse than in the north, and in the north, some regions of the north a lot worse than other regions. Nonetheless, it is an occasion. It is an occasion. Disability is here, and it's not going anywhere.
Right.
In fact, if disability is going to do anything, we're going to increase in number.
Look, can I? Because here we are in beautiful sunny Toronto in Canada.
All right, let's stop it there, because that's a lot of things that I want to unpack. Two things that Dr. McCarthy talks about that I want to open up to all of you this morning, especially as we think about, people with disabilities in the church. Thank you, Bob. In Reverend Keith's sermon this morning, I was thinking about, the Samaritan woman, right? And how our own challenges could have been, a disability for her, given the context that she found herself in. And how, of course, Jesus was able to free her. And in the freeing, Dr. Michaelko talks about the coolness of disability. He said when he thinks about disability, his own blindness, he says, to me, that's not even cool, right? There's so many challenges and consequences that comes with blindness. But he had this wonderful dog, Smokey, which Michaelko ended up writing this beautiful book about Smokey and his blindness. He said, Smokey made my blindness cool, right? And so I wanted to open that up to you to think about what are some things for you that could make people with disabilities' lives cool or their disability cool. I'll give you an example. In my case, when I think of my parents, given what I went through, getting in an education, the fight, and their constant love, and my mother insisting that she was going to care for me and love me, that made my disability cool, right? That love for my mother, that fight to get an education, and the fact that I'm here in front of you to be able to do this, that made my disability cool. So it's the response, it's the interpretation, right, that we give disability that could make someone's disability cool or not cool. We have a duty as well. The medical condition is one, but are we going to accept it, right? Are we going to deal with it, right? And so what are your thoughts? How can we make disabilities cool here in the church, or if you've got relatives, what are you going to do to make people's disabilities cool?
You don't have to talk, but I'm just going to give you the microphone and then pass it to the person who wants to talk.
Do you want to talk? Yeah, sure. I wonder how maybe some people are in denial of this. I think, like my husband and I, even though we're getting older, we're sort of, we won't look for the closest parking spot because we're determined that we're not going to be disabled in any way at all. So sometimes I wonder if there's a psychological thing involved with disability. I mean, there are genuinely people, I know, I've known many, who have needed help but have actually refused it. I just think a perfect example when you think about blindness is Andrea Bocelli. I think that he does not think of it as being disabled. I mean, you look at him riding a horse and all the things that he does in his life. So how do we classify disabled? Do you think it's true? Some people don't want to be. I don't want to be disabled. I hope I won't. I pray that God will give us strength to walk around as long as we can. But then, on the other hand, over the years I worked with in cardiology, it was, they couldn't wait to get a disabled sticker to go on their car, where walking is the best thing to do. So, I don't know.
Thank you. That's a pivotal point that you just made. And I think part of the challenge is that we've been made to believe, right, that disability is such a terrible thing, right, from society. So all of the social ramifications that comes with being disabled has been kind of scrutinized into our minds and into our bodies and into our souls. And so it has created fear, and like you're saying, if you were to think about this, if I were to draw an imaginary line, right? Think about society, for example, how we think about the normal, how we think about perfection, right? So everything above, right, says that you have to walk a certain way, right? You've got to look good, you've got to have a certain body type, and so on and so forth. And all of that will be at the top of this imaginary line. And then at the bottom, what do you think? Where do we put people with disabilities, right? We put them at this bottom level that, they're undervalued, they're not good enough, or that we pity them. We assume, we make so many assumptions. And so that has been embedded, from the moment you were born. It has been embedded into our psyche. And I think that's a difficult thing, because what I have seen when I was doing one of my research with polio survivors and resilience, one of the greatest things I found out was not so much the medical condition itself, but it was the psychological, right? And the struggle for a lot of people is to be loved, to feel like they belong, right? Or what are people going to say about me? Or how are people going to view me now? Or am I going to be accepted and loved in society? And so you're definitely right. I mean, that's a struggle for a lot of people. You're not alone in that, but it has to be a mindset. We talk in education, we talk about growth mindset as opposed to fixed mindset. Fixed mindset, we've been told that, we're not smart, who are we to do this, if I did not do well in primary or elementary school or middle school or high school, who am I to be brilliant, right, or gorgeous and so on and so on. And we get stuck with that. Now, the growth mindset says, right, I have to restructure my ideology about how I think about myself. And I think we've got to take on a growth mindset to see that disability is part of the human experience. That as we age, especially as we age, we're likely going to have eyesight problems. We're likely going to have walking problems or whatever challenges that we're going to have. And so in that regard, we've got to make that mind shift. Yes, sir.
I would just like to mention that my disability of hearing loss is very much helped and supported by the broadcast of this program. So I am in fact 6 seconds behind you lot. It's very difficult to clap at the right time. But it helps me a great deal.
That is cool. Yes.
I think we have misconceptions about disabilities, which is on us, because we see disabilities as something that's lifelong, but they could happen at any point in our life. And this is only our second session, and I've already taken away something so important. We will all get there. I am looking at my own situation, which is completely apropos for what's happening now, is I'm looking forward, not really, but I have foot surgery in my future, and I have been struggling with it. A little bit about the surgery and the pain, but more so afterwards. I'm going to be a burden to my family. They're going to have to haul me everywhere. I'll be missing church. How am I going to take a shower? How am I going to take care of the fur babies? How am I going to do this? And I never even thought about it before. And it's just been weighing on me. So we have to open up and think beyond the box that we're all, like you said, I took away that from the first session. If I don't come anymore, I don't think the surgery will be in the next, I'll be able to attend all of them. But I took away, we will all get there at some point. It may not be as a child such as yourself, but you know, we all age, and we all will find ourselves in some type of situation where we will be dependent on other people. And that is the worst struggle for me, being dependent on, I have to go here, and it's just, you know, and I think that's a struggle that we all face. We don't want to be dependent on people to take us here or there, or to do this or to do that, or come and feed the dog, or to pull the weeds in the backyard. So this timing is just wonderful, what you're doing here, because it does give us a lot to think about, and we have to think beyond the box. You know, that it's not somebody that necessarily that is born blind or hearing impaired or with polio, but you know, it could be an accident in a car accident. So I don't think people think about that. I never did.
Yeah. Rachel, thank you. Wow, well said, well said. Couple of points I want to make. This is why activism, you know, is such a great tool, and what people with disabilities did with the disability rights movement in the 60s, you know, following the civil rights, was so powerful. Because we have to think, what you're saying, Rachel, is we've got to think about how we restructure society, right? Part of the problem why we are also stuck is, number one, the ideology of independence. It's been so ingrained in us, right, that, you know, you tie yourself by your bootstraps, which is a myth. None of us can tie ourselves by the bootstrap anyway. I mean, or the ideology, you know, I don't need a God, right? I'm a master of my own destiny. Another great myth that we pass on to people, right? So if we're to restructure to society where instead of this ideology of independence, we think about interdependence, right? Where people understand, you know, in some other cultures, I mean, this is very much, this independence ideology is very much a westernized society. But if you go across the globe in other countries, whether it's even in Native Americans, they believe in community, right? And they never, you know, got rid of old people. It was you know, or even thinking about taking your parents, right? I grew up in Sierra Leone. I mean, everything is changing. We're all following westernized societies now. But it would have been a disservice to if my parents had lived long. I mean, they died young. You know, for us to even imagine of taking our parents to a nursing home or some kind of facility, right? It would have to be our own responsibility. That community to love each other, do things in community. And I think that's what we have to start thinking about in terms of, you know, more interdependence. How do we work together? How do we love one another, right? And so much so that when you're getting older, you will know and you don't have to feel like you're going to be a burden, right? As a lot of people are struggling with. It is Whenever I'm teaching a class like this, that's exactly, Rachel, what you say. It's one of the biggest struggles that people are faced with, right? The fact that I'm going to be a burden on others, right? But could it be? Should it be?
Think about it until you're in that situation. I never gave it a second thought. And you need to start thinking about things like that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let me tell you a quick story, something that really felt. Two people in my life that I think is worth sharing. So I had an uncle, my dad's brother. He studied in England. He was an engineer, and he went, he was born at the right time, so got his degree in engineering and went to Sierra Leone and was able to do quite a lot after independence, to build quite a lot of the main structures, including the Bank of Sierra Leone and all of that. Did a lot of things, and he did well for himself. And he became blind just towards his late 40s and just about 50. And we saw this man, very tall, man of stature. He walked like a king, had a nice family. But then he deteriorated and fell into depression, serious depression. And within 2 or 3 years of his blindness, he was dead, right? Talk about being a burden. I'm sure that was going through his mind. But then, here is a different story. When I was a freshman in my undergraduate years, because I did my undergrad at the University of Sierra Leone, I was volunteering for UNICEF because we had a challenge with vaccination in the country. I mean, people were not vaccinating their children, and United Nations was getting worried that a lot of people were going to get polio or one of these childhood diseases. So they knew about my story, and they thought that I would be a good, voice for that kind of thing, and they brought me in to volunteer. And during my voluntary years, they asked me that one of the problems we don't have an umbrella organization for people with disabilities. Would you mind taking the lead? I was only 18 years old, so I got scared, and I said, I don't know if I'm too young for this. So somebody mentioned to me during, in my own fears and worries about taking on that kind of leadership role, why don't you go and meet, the president of the university. He had just retired, who was also blind. He said he's made a name for himself. He's published a lot of books. People know him. He's got the reputation. I think he will be good. And I went to meet Dr. Eldred Jones. And I tell you, he was such an amazing person. He became blind. He had a bad eyesight since birth, so he gradually was becoming blind anyway, and he knew he was going to be blind. Whether it was because of the gradual process, I sometimes wonder when I compare him and my uncle, maybe he had this long preparation to prepare for his blindness, but he did something in the interim. Because he knew he was going to be blind, he started studying Braille, right? And so by the time he became blind, he was a master in Braille, and his scholarship did not suffer. Even though he was blind, the man he was like Dr. Rod McAlco, so prolific. They were asking him to do presentations all over the country, doing good for himself. But two different stories, right? One was able to prepare for blindness, two different mindsets, right? And I mentioned that story because it's all about mindset, right? It's all about how do we think about these things in terms of that will enormously, because what's going to ultimately kill you is not so much the condition, but it's your psychological state, right? And that is something for us to be mindful about. Any other thoughts? Anybody else wants to share? Sharon? I know we're almost due for time here. Reverend Keith, do you have anything to add before we round things up?
I was just thinking about if I understood the question about coolness and disability. I'm thinking representation matters. So seeing people with disabilities represented in movies, TV, are always helpful. There's one irreverent comedy, I believe Out of Darkness is interesting to watch. And growing up with comic books, the mutants are always have its own spin on either BIPOC communities or people with mutations. So that's always been an interesting, sometimes problematic, but an interesting way to approach disabilities. The other two things that come to mind is I've got some colleagues who devote a lot of time for Special Olympics. And then the other thing is thinking about seeing how some amputees, people with artificial limbs, are going away from, something that simulates a real, with fleshy looking appendages, to something that just looks bionic and cool.
Wow, thank you so much, Reverend Keith, for that. I'll wrap things up here because we've run out of time. So lots of things to discuss. Lots of things to think about. But I want us to be really thinking about the church, right? Because what we're going to start with next week is, what are the barriers? And if you can see, if you go back to my my handouts, I list a number of barriers that we have. I'll just list some that I think of. I'll talk about theological barriers, which is a big challenge. I'll kind of explain that next week. But we'll also think about communication barriers. We think about leadership barriers. We think about body life barriers and all of those kinds of things. So be thinking about that, and how are we going to make, disability cool in the church, right? What would Jesus like for us to do, as a church community? And also, I want to challenge you also as you go out to think about what Dr. Rod Michalko said. It's an occasion, right? All these definitions, whether it's a dictionary definition or a medical definition of disability, but I like what Michalko talks about. Disability is an occasion for us to look at ourselves, right? For us to challenge ourselves, to question ourselves about what we think about the broken body, right? What do we think about, our humanness, right? What does it mean? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, no, Rachel, you're fine. I want you to interrupt. That is cool. Now Reverend Keith, do you mind praying us out?
God be with you. Let us pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks for encountering the woman at the well in all forms and shapes and ways. Let us be mindful of how we can be attentive to the person in front of us, remembering that we are all created in your image. In your most holy name we pray.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you. And making this a rich discussion. Have a blessed week. So next week we're meeting here, right? Yeah. And then what about the 16th? Yes. Yeah. Okay, yes. Yeah. Rest of the sessions. Bring your friends.